University in Montreal, and he coordinates the law and governance research for the leadership for the Ecological program at McGill and University of Vermont. He's on the steering committee of the Ecological Law and Governance Association, and is in that role also very active in the international degrowth movement. Jeff was the director of submissions on enforcement matters at the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, and also worked at the US Environmental Protection Agency. His fairly well-known book, Ecological Law and the Planetary Crisis, was published in 2021 with Routledge. He has a BS in chemical engineering, JD from the University of Michigan Law School, an LLM from McGill Faculty of Law, as well as a PhD in geography from McGill University. Jeff, welcome. We look forward to listening to your provocatively titled presentation on territories of life and sacrifice zones. And again, please note that this is being recorded. If you do not consent to this, feel free to switch off your camera. Otherwise, we will proceed to listen to Jeff. Floor is yours.
So, ich freue mich, hier in Potsdam zu sein. Meine Mutter wurde hier geboren, daher ist es eine wichtige Stadt in meiner Familiengeschichte. Unfortunately, my mother never taught me German, so I am going to leave the German there. And thank Louis and the Resource Institute for Sustainability for inviting me to talk about my work on ecological law and this recent emergent project for me that focusing or framing ecological law around the idea of territories of life and sacrifice zones. So before I just okay. So I want to start by telling you that over the last week, I've done a bike ride from Berlin to Hamburg, and this was to retrace a bike ride my mother did at the end of the war in May 1945 when she was just 23 years old. From Brandenburg, where she was in a bomb shelter, and 30 minutes before the Russian soldiers arrived, she fled on bike with two other women, and she made her way all the way up near the Danish border in a little town called Lose. So for years, I wanted to create this trip, and I just finished it up in Hamburg 2 days ago. I mention this because while riding, I was very conscious of riding through territory that when my mother rode through it was a war zone. And if we're going to talk about territories of life and sacrifices that are sometimes deemed by some people to be justified, there really is nothing more of an antithesis of a territory of life than war. So it was, of course, for my family history, very interesting, but for seeing this territory as something that is recovering from war, knowing that, of course, there are many war zones still going on in the world, was something that was on my mind, particularly in these days, and is something in my mind as I think through this idea of territories of life. So what I want to do is just give you some context for this topic in terms of the ecological crisis that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, just how I contextualize this in this particular case. Acknowledge some historical pathways that are relevant here, talk about what I mean and others mean by territories of life and sacrifice zones. And then talk a little about how this idea of territories of life can be a frame for a long-term vision for ecological law. So in terms of the ecological crisis, I really want to focus on the idea of planetary boundaries or ecological limits, the importance of the growth conundrum in this ecological crisis, and plurality and territories of life in the context of core features of ecological law. So here in Potsdam, where I believe Johan Wachström is, I'm sure many of you are very familiar now with the planetary boundaries concept. The original paper came out as I was starting my LLM and geography studies at McGill, and it immediately grabbed my imagination. My core research question was, because I had learned a little about ecological economics, well, what's the law angle of this? And I immediately saw planetary boundaries as relevant, especially this statement in the first paper that planetary boundaries could serve as the basis for novel and adaptive governance approaches at global, regional, and local scales. So planetary boundaries and other measures or indicators of ecological limits are a very important concept. And we know from planetary boundaries research that not only are they interesting metrics, but we have crossed into very dangerous zones for several of them. Another set of graphs that jumped out at me when I first saw them and still remain relevant is, and this, I think it was Will Steffen who first put these together. This is from a paper by Bay et al. In 2016, but showing the correlation, the similar hockey stick shapes of the socioeconomic trends over the Industrial Revolution. These graphs go from about 1550 to the present. So population, GDP growth. I like different versions of this will show different things: fertilizer consumption, paper production, and so on. In this case, and how closely those socioeconomic trends map onto Earth system trends, carbon, carbon oxide and dioxide and other GHGs in the atmosphere, the surface temperature of the planet, ocean acidification, threats to biodiversity, accumulation of nutrients in various zones, and so on. So, just one more thing about this. If you can focus on that real GDP curve, you can see that it looks like all of the other socioeconomic trends, and so it puts in context these mutually exclusive narratives that are central in my thinking about ecological law and how territories of life could be a frame for them. So those graphs, what we're learning about planetary boundaries and how we're crossing them, put into dynamic tension two what I think are mutually exclusive narratives. One is the growth-insistent narrative, which really is the narrative of any G20 meeting. If you look at the communiques, which I force myself to do despite the bad feeling I get, they always are looking for increasing growth and increasing trade, and all of this to create jobs and so on. This is the economic model that is well established now in national and international arenas. So, not surprising, most formal UN declarations or documents are also going to reference growth insistence. This is the narrative of neoclassical economists, most conventional economists, eco-modernists, and so on. And in tension with that is a more limits-insistent approach, where staying within boundaries, for example, becomes the primary imperative of human projects, of human enterprises, of the human economy. And in this tension is where the idea of putting concepts like a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship, an important concept brought to us by Thomas Berry in his book, The Great Work, and others, of giving primacy to ecological limits rather than to insistence on economic growth, of new ways to think of human interspecies and intergenerational fairness. This is a tension from which ideas in ecological economics and degrowth and in ecological approaches to law are emerging. This tension then, of course, if we are going to move in the direction of staying within planetary boundaries, puts into focus the challenge of transition. If growth insistence is ecologically unsustainable in the long term, what does ecological law imply about the transition away from growth? We know if we're starting today, we have to start within a growth insistent scenario. So then what are the principles of transition that we can incorporate into ecological law and other human conceptual framings of trying to stay within limits? And if I say human conceptual, I'm making a distinction from technological ones. So socio-political innovation must complement technological innovation is a takeaway in terms of the challenges of transition. This is from this quote here is from Johan Rockström in the movie Breaking Boundaries. Now it's a question of framing the entire growth model around sustainability and have the planet guide everything we do. Well, absolutely, we need to put the planetary boundaries and other metrics of ecological limits front and center. We also, for now, I would say, need to frame the entire growth model, which is what we have around sustainability. But my message here today, in terms of thinking of territories of life, is eventually moving away from a growth insistent model, because the shape of those curves I showed you earlier suggests an impossibility of things working out very well for the planet, for humans and other life, if we don't do that. So a transitional but not a long-term strategy, keeping growth in front and center. So when I was first developing this idea of ecological law, I developed key features that I still continue to find useful. I haven't really found a reason to move away from any of these. So how I conceptualize and others conceptualize ecological laws is that humans are part of Earth-like systems. They're not separate from it. So this is more of a ecocentric or human inclusive ecocentric approach to law. Primacy of ecological boundaries over socioeconomic spheres is a key feature. This implies the full integration of ecological limits in rules and policy. So even though I co-edited a book called From Environmental Law to Ecological Law, it should be from conventional law, from current understandings of law to ecological law, because if you're giving primacy to ecological boundaries, then ecological approaches have to come into and be primary in areas of the law that we're not used to thinking of them being primary. Corporate law, more economic forms of law, property law, and so on. The current situation, those graphs I showed you early, means that we have to focus on reducing material and energy throughput, use of biocapacity and extracted materials must be based on real need, not on utilitarian desires or market prices. This is extremely hard to move away from. But if we understand and truly appreciate that we're in a crisis situation, then focusing on real need and maybe seeing luxuries, clear luxuries, as extraneous and no longer acceptable because of the contribution to the global ecological crisis. That sort of thinking is going to have to become necessary. Binding and supranational rules as needed. I think Europe is still a very interesting and leading model. You have European directives that take precedence over national rules. I know that's always been touchy in Europe, and it can still create tensions. But in fact, Europe, with its environmental directives that are implemented by the nation, by the member states, it is a model that's very interesting in terms of ecological law. Fair sharing among present and future generations of life. The point here is that in my and others' conception of ecological law, we're extending the moral community more and more to include life beyond humans. Expanded research and monitoring and knowledge to focus on what's needed to make ecological boundaries primary in terms of our social and political and legal systems. precaution about crossing planetary boundaries, ecological boundaries. This is an area where I think Europe is almost certainly ahead of Canada and the United States. They are throwing my two countries, I'm a citizen of both Canada and the United States, seem to throw caution to the wind, so to speak, in terms of a lot of ecological boundaries, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And the proposal here is that law has to be adaptive and regenerative. We're used to law being certain and unchanging, but this, I and others are suggesting more of an adaptive approach to law. My friend Carla Spare, in her book, The Lens of Ecological Law, has very usefully condensed these principles into features, what I call features, into the principles of ecocentrism, ecological primacy, and ecological justice. So I'm not going to spend time going through them, but they capture the idea of human inclusive ecocentrism, of giving primacy to ecological boundaries, and to rethinking questions of fairness and justice. Here's another graph that I will not take the time to go through in detail, but it really shows that the distinction between contemporary law, and here again, I don't want to say environmental law, I want to refer to prevailing legal systems at both national, subnational, and global levels, and at international levels, and how they contrast with ecological law. So anthropocentric versus ecocentric, reductionist, fragmented versus holistic, integrated, and system-based. An emphasis on efficiency without paying attention to the Jevons principles, so that, which says that the more we use material resources, energy resources, the more efficient we become in using them, the more of them we use. So we have good measures now yet in place to prevent that from happening. Whereas ecological would promote sufficiency, again, this idea of true needs. In terms of scale, our current legal systems and related systems have a strong commitment to state sovereignty, whereas ecological law offers an opportunity to focus more on the subsidiarity principle. Fairness, in our current legal, economic, and political systems, there seems to be a core belief in the fairness of markets. If I'm allowed to buy something, then it must be okay. But we know that globally, we still are overproducing and overconsuming in ways that are pushing against critical ecological boundaries. In terms of fairness, then we need new approaches in ecological law, and then different approaches as well to monitoring and adaptation, really moving more from a weak precautionary approach, or as in the US and Canada, really not using a precautionary approach at all, to a much stronger precautionary approach. I have a list of terms that I associate in the extreme form, because there are nuances here. It's not all black and white here, but concepts that align with this growth-insistent model that's turning out to be ecologically, and in many cases socially problematic, with a more regenerative approach that I align with ecological law. So anthropocentric versus human inclusive, ecocentric. Colonialism versus localism and attachment to place. Efficiency versus efficiency. Petromasculinity, this is a new term to me, but boy, it says it all, versus ecofeminism. Rational actors versus plurality, interrelationship. Rational actors meaning our economics assume us we're all greedy people just wanting to get as rich as possible. That's not how things work in the real world, or in many cases. Moving away from monetary valuation, I have a whole set of ideas around conceptual monocultures, and the central conceptual monoculture that to me is problematic is the one for value, and that we use money, which is based on utilitarian needs and desires, as a single criteria measure of valuation. So the ecological law would look more at multi-criteria evaluation. Commodification profit, as opposed to respect, interest subjectivity, reciprocity. individual and private interests versus communities and the common good, monocultures versus diversity, selfishness versus sharing and solidarity, hubris versus humility and precaution. And I'm building that list. If you have any suggestions on other framings, I'm open to hearing them. So acknowledging historical pathways. Well, what we're dealing with, from my perspective, is a historical pathway in which the co-evolution of colonialism and capitalism has been quite important. Where and out of this has come the contemporary problem of remote ownership and control. And related to this is the intractability of utilitarianism and the price mechanism as a surrogate for needs. So core foundations of the dominant regime that law currently serves: human exceptionalism, commitment to growth, state sovereignty, strong protection of private property rights, monetization and commodification, and this focus on the single measure of value. So we see this, for example, in monetary valuation of ecosystem services, capitalism, and the protection of corporations. And in terms of the territories of life and how we think of territory, this problem of remote ownership and is particularly interesting, and it emerges from, again, this co-evolution of capitalism and legacies of colonialism. One of the books I've read recently that I found quite interesting and helped me shape some thinking around this, it's very well presented, is this book by Raj Patel and James Moore, The History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. And they tell the story of Madeira, which was discovered by Portuguese sailors, Ilha de Madeira, in 1419. Why was it called Madeira? Because it was heavily forested, and it was an unsettled island of wood. Between 1419 and the 1430s, there was massive deforestation as the wood was used for shipbuilding, and then the cleared land used for wheat cultivation. So it didn't take long for Madeira to become largely deforested. After that, there was more deforestation as sugar production began, and this was also near the beginnings of the global slave trade. So, at least as that's presented in this book, this was an early prototype of factories in industrialization in terms of the division of labor. You couldn't have the slaves who were cutting the cane also be the ones that were working in processing it, turning it into sugar, because that had to be done very quickly, and so you needed separate groups of people. Long discussions of this, but I found this quite convincing. And there was also foreign financing. So you have remote investors who are not really concerned about what's happening on Madeira. They're wondering how much return they're going to get on their investment. If anyone has a retirement account, that might sound familiar. And so by the 1530s, pretty much no more trees. And at that point, then, because you didn't have the trees around to power the sugarcane factories, essentially sugar production shifted elsewhere, Brazil, the Caribbean, and so on. And then there were new capitalist ventures on Madeira. Wine, slave trade continued for a while, and today it's tourism. So the legacy of Madeira and other prototypes of colonialism and capitalism have some commonalities. First, in many cases, this was kind of justified or authorized through things like the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of reception, where Western legal systems were imposed in new places. And not just legal systems, but entire worldviews and thought systems were imported and imposed. So over time, state and international legal systems adapted to support the corporations, capitalism, and foreign investment. So this idea of foreign investors, it won't take long thinking about it. It's how intricate that is, and how deeply embedded it is in our global economic system. So modern trade agreements drive production toward places with the lowest environmental and labor costs. investor dispute provisions allow foreign investors to sue state governments for not treating the same as they treat their own investors and other violations of those provisions. So through this, all ecosystems, people, livelihoods are sacrificed to the greater good defined by growth and capitalism. I thought about how this would apply in Canada, where I live now. And by the way, Montreal is having one paper reported today, the worst air pollution in the world today because of forest fires in Canada. So I guess I'd rather have a rainstorm in Potsdam, but maybe there's a little bit of climate change stuff going on in both those places. But in Canada, so you have these different perspectives. When I moved to Canada, I thought, as an American, well, strong, very green country, very strong environmental protections. It's actually not true at all, and that's a long story. It has to do with the division of jurisdiction between the federal government and the provinces going back to the formation of Canada in the 19th century. But the federal government has very weak environmental jurisdiction. So the provinces are very strong. You don't even have the same level of federal control that you have in Europe. So the federalism in Canada is very problematic in terms of the environment. So the provinces are the main regulators of the environment, but they don't have common rules to follow. So there is a case that's pending now before the Supreme Court of Canada, which is challenging Canada's new Impact Assessment Act because it infringes too much on provincial jurisdiction. And in particular, the federal government says that there's any relationship essentially with climate change, then it's federalized and you can do a federal impact analysis. Well, Alberta's got the oil sands, and they're very protective of those. So they've challenged that law, and a court of appeals held that it was unconstitutional. That will probably get reversed in the Supreme Court, but it shows these perspectives. From the Alberta perspective, the land and resources of Alberta belong to Alberta, which has the right to allow their exploitation for sale in global markets. So you can see there the jurisdiction, the sovereignty question, and also the ownership question. How is the land and the resources there treated from a perspective of property? The federal government, yeah, the provinces have right to develop their resources, but if the impacts affect federal interests like climate change, the federal government can stop projects in the public interest. I'll get to the last part of that quote about not considering downstream greenhouse gas emissions in a minute. But then you have First Nations, the people who were there before colonialism in Canada. Their perspective is the doctrines of discovery and of reception still deny Canada's First Peoples the authority to apply their legal traditions and practices with respect to land, ecosystems, and human life with which they have age-old relationships. So what I would suggest here is that from the Alberta and federal government perspective, these territories are territories of exploitation for profit and royalties. The perspective of First Nations in Canada is one that's more geared towards territories of life. So what do I mean by territories of life? There is a global consortium. This is certainly not an idea that I came up with, the ICCA consortium, which says that an ICCA or a territory of life exists where there's a close and deep connection between a territory or area and its custodian Indigenous people or local community. The custodian people or community makes and enforces decisions and rules about the territory or area through a functioning governance institution. And that governance and the management efforts of the concerned people or community overall positively contribute not only to the conservation of nature, but also to community livelihoods and well-being. And this consortium talks about defined territories of life. So this is places where these kinds of governance systems are still ensuring some kind of sustainability. Disrupted ones are ones where that might have been the case, but for some reason or other, they cannot be called a fully defined territory of life. And then even further away from a territory of an existing territory of life would be desired territory of life. So these would be territories where you'd like to at some point reestablish a territory of life. And if you're seeing echoes of the work of Eleanor Ostrom and others, I don't think that's by accident. This is certainly an adaptation to it. So when I learned about this concept and building off my thinking on ecological law, this question came to me that shouldn't every place on Earth be considered a territory of life? I mean, why wouldn't we think of every place on Earth to be considered a territory of life? Preserving whatever life exists there and not eroding the capacity of different areas to support the life that they have historically supported. So my answer is yes, or at least let's try to make that answer yes, to ensure ecological justice, among other things. But of course, it's very, very complicated in our modern world, where 50% of the Earth's people live in cities. People migrate for various reasons, including climate. And for many reasons, many people seem to have lost a sense of belonging to or a connection to place. So despite these challenges, I think of ecological law as a way to envision and work towards Earth is made up entirely of territories of life. And what do I mean by a sacrifice zone? So here's a definition from one paper. A sacrifice zone is a segregated and stigmatized space where the physical and mental health and the quality of life of human beings, and let's just throw in other life, are compromised in the name of economic development or progress, but ultimately for the sake of capital interests. So this is a fairly well-recognized idea. And it's interesting to recall that sacrifice has the same root as sacred. So we're talking about zones where these sacrifices are made to something that's held as sacred or extremely important. Well, in our current model, that seems to be growth and wealth accumulation, all in the name of how the dominant regimes of law and politics and so on define well-being and progress. So I'm suggesting here that new approaches to the common good are needed if we're going to talk about what is sacred and what sacrifices are appropriate. Can we imagine territories of life and restored places in which a different kind of sacrifice zone, or when the kind of sacrifice zone that's referred to here no longer exists, and instead, to the extent there are sacrifice zones, they're consistent with Indigenous thinking, ecological knowledge of many Indigenous people and other communities. So this idea of the honorable harvest, you take other life with respect and no more than you need. Respect and reciprocity, appreciation of gifts, ceremony, and so on. A little bit before I flew over to Europe, this headline jumped out at me. Federal minister open to sacrificing part of marine refuge for oil discovery. So there's very controversial exploration and eventually, hopefully, I guess for this minister, development of oil off of the Newfoundland and Labrador coast and water that's about 1.2 to 1.3 kilometers deep. So cold water habitats, and Canada, in addition to being open to oil exploration, has also established a marine refuge there. And so the question posed to Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, who's pictured here, was, well, what if you find oil from this oil exploration that you're allowing? I said, well, we might have to just remove those protections from the marine refuge. We might have to sacrifice the marine refuge. So again, here, what are we holding sacred? What are we holding important in the middle of a climate crisis? Ironically, 2 days later, we had this headline: Canada marks Clean Air Day with worst air quality in the world. Apparently, that's continuing several weeks later, and this is because of massive forest fires happening in Canada that are unquestionably happening now at an increased frequency because of climate change. Apparently that irony is lost on our federal minister of natural resources. Here's just a little bit more about that. So a few years ago, there was a regional assessment of an offshore oil and gas exploratory drilling east of Newfoundland and Labrador, out in the ocean. One thing that's notable about this is that this regional assessment, now this is like a regional or strategic assessment. It's like in other situations, you do a broad scoped assessment. So then when you actually do specific projects, you can do a more streamlined assessment. What's happening here is that neither the regional assessment nor the individual project assessments are taking into account at all downstream greenhouse gas emissions. That's because apparently it's unforeseeable what's going to happen with them. That's some major effort to keep your eyes wide shut to a global emergency. So a new regulation was adopted, and it's allowing this oil and gas exploration to happen again without consideration of downstream emissions. Many conditions that supposedly are going to make this the least harmful possible in a 1.2 to 1.3 kilometer deep cold water zone. But you have to wonder just what the best possible in that situation is. Here's just to show you where the overlap. And if you look at the two graphs here, you can see where Newfoundland is, with the green on the left and the white on the right, those shapes, and you can see where the orange marine refuge is, and then on the left, all of the exploratory and proposed and eventually oil development zones have a very, very close overlap. So this is what's happening. Sacrifice the marine refuge for oil development in the middle of a climate emergency. That's what's happening in Canada. Another indication of at least what's happening in Canada is there's work on the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is really about toxic chemicals and so on. And there's been a lot of effort to include some environmental justice issues in there, because some following this more narrow definition of sacrifice zones, there are several of these zones where chemical industries are being located next to First Nations communities with well-documented health effects over decades. So there's now an effort to do something about it, but a lot of controversy over whether it's enough. All right, and let me now just turn to this idea of territories of life as a frame for a long-term vision for ecological law. So Louis mentioned that I work for the leadership for the Ecozoic project at McGill. I invite you to check that out, or ecozoic.org, or just leadership for the Ecozoic. There's not a lot of other places that use Ecozoic in the title, so you'll find it. But this is our vision for the law and governance work that I'm coordinating. We envision a proliferation of law and governance systems and approaches that are increasingly aligned with the core concepts underpinning the Ecozoic and the territories of life, with a view to significantly shaping societal trajectories. The Ecozoic is the future epic or period of time that Thomas Berry envisioned, in which there was a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. So, building off of what I presented so far, some lessons from place-based approaches that we're trying to bring into this work are related to commons governance, ecocultural restoration, territories of life, and so on. So a core idea here is that place-based land governance is as diverse and pluralistic as Earth's ecosystems and local cultures. And this is an idea that needs to be acknowledged and deepened, so that looking at any place as a sacrifice zone needs to be has to take into account that you're dealing with a diverse, with a special place. Territories of life should be linked through bottom-up commonalities, not top-down imposed uniformity. So broad topic here, but my thesis would be that what we have now is a lot of top-down imposed uniformity on different places. Key role for human choice, intention, and goal-oriented intervention connected to place. So rather having sort of quote-unquote free markets deciding which places get sacrificed or used in different ways, there would be a different kind of choice, intention, and goal-oriented intervention. Place-based, the place-suited monitoring adaptation with sanctions. This would be kind of building off of Eleanor Austin's work. A flexible range of locally tailored options for resilient territories of life. This is building on the idea of the diversity. And I think what's coming out of a lot of work about commons governance or territories of life is that participatory dialogue and decision-making is essential. What we're doing in L4E then, applying these ideas, falls into two categories. First, we're engaging with communities with existing legal systems and traditions and legalities that continue to support and enhance territories of life, but are under pressures and threats from other legal systems and legalities. Well, in fact, you can find examples of maybe some existing territories, but we're trying to apply the idea of territories of life to these broad watersheds near Montreal. The Chateauguay River is a transboundary watershed. The source of that river is in New York State. In the United States, it flows across the border into the St. Lawrence River, right at the Ganawagi Reservation of the Mohawks. So you have indigenous people, but it's farmland, it's forested land. There is now a crisis of illegal or weakly regulated construction waste dumping going on, and that's threatening aquifers and so on. The Champlain at Richelieu watershed as well starts in Vermont and flows north into the St. Lawrence, a little bit east of Montreal. They're contiguous and they're very diverse in how they're being used. There as well, there are some indigenous communities, the Wabanaki. So we're engaging with communities that are aware of threats and seeing how far we can go to work with them to imagine those entire watersheds as territories of life. Looking at maybe the low-hanging fruit, the things that we can achieve in the short term, but also keeping this long-term vision of seeing and envisioning those watersheds in the far future on the horizon as functioning, thriving territories of life. So many of those right now are disrupted, what we call disrupted or desired. But that vision, holding that vision out and then using that to be innovative is what's going on there. The other thing that I'm working on is conducting ecological law case studies to show how ecological law would reestablish territories of life with an emphasis on places where globally dominant legal systems that align with growth, capitalism, and legacies of colonialism have damaged ecosystems and communities attached to them. So here are these two watersheds that I described. You can see their transboundary, I think it's useful. There's this really interesting website, nativeland.ca, that so you're looking at the exact same place here, one from the traditional territories of the first peoples of this region and how they overlap. And of course, those were very fluid boundaries. They weren't the tight, strict political boundaries you have today. And then how it looks from a political map today. So that sort of frames the challenge in ways that I hope are obvious. Riding my bike through Haviland, I met a second cousin who happens to be working on Natura 2000 and trying to apply habitat protections on a watershed or a regional scale, which I thought resonated a lot with these ideas. So one piece of homework I took away from my trip to Germany this year is to find out more about this and how something like Natura 2000, this Europe-wide program that I'm sure many of you are familiar with could align with some of these ideas I'm talking about today. Just a little bit more on where that is. We rode through Rattenau and then to Havelberg, and you can see this map on the upper right just shows some of the diking and water management projects they had there to protect habitat for birds and various species. Ecological law case studies. The idea here is to take a project, or in some cases it's an international agreement or some aspect of our current system, deconstruct it, try to figure out what kind of environmentalism law is involved, but also those other kinds of law that I said need to be looked at differently if we're moving towards ecological law, property law, labor law, and so on, from the local, regional, national, and global level, and then analyze what within that array of law aligns with this vision of territories of life or ecological law and what doesn't. And then how would you reconstruct that situation in a transitional phase and then with this long-term vision of territories of life everywhere. So we started this project in 2000, midway through. COVID did not help move this along that fast, but this was this YouTube video shows where we were with the original set of case studies we had lined up. Now we have a book contract. This just came through in the last few weeks. Very delighted that happened, and we have 11 of these case studies. So you can see some dealing with development projects, some dealing with wild plants and animals, restoration of damaged sites and ecosystems, international engagements, community and civil society engagements. And you can see they range across the globe. We have some in South America and Brazil, and Africa and Nigeria, Oceania, global in terms of the high seas treaty and marine diversity, and then some in North America. So really excited to have that project move along. Rights of nature, can it be a bridge? Well, I am really captivated about the whole Whanganui River situation as a possible case of transformation of that watershed into a territory of life. So this is another bit of homework. I think from what I understand, you would call most of that watershed still a disrupted or desired territory of life. So this is a real-time experiment under the framework of rights of nature, which in many cases, in many senses, align with territories of life and ecological law. I think it's interesting just to keep in mind how big a territory we're looking at here from this graphic. The catchment is huge. So it's similar to these catchments we're looking at near Montreal to Brandenburg, if you're looking at Natura 2000 and so on. I think that's the scale where we need to start envisioning territories of life and ecological law. Rights are complicated, though. From my thinking in ecological law, there are some very sort of core anthropocentric ideas that tied to rights that may be problematic as this moves along, and that's what I'm trying to capture in this graphic. So I like to keep in mind these couple of ways to think about rights of nature. When we think about ecosystem services to humans, how about we also think about human services to ecosystems? So when I mentioned that, some people said, I don't know what you mean. I said, well, I'm not sure I fully know what I mean either, but it's an important thing to keep in mind if we're talking about reciprocity, if we're talking about mutually enhancing human-earth relationships. And what about, instead of focusing on rights of nature as giving personhood to nature in law, especially if the person we're talking about is the rational actor of conventional economics, we work towards ecological law that gives naturehood to people in law. And when I did research on this and tried to find naturehood in the legal context, I came up with one paper, which just shows that this is an idea to develop. That's what it shows to me, to just shake up our thinking on how and how we think of rights of nature. Just a few words on some troubling counter narratives. I'll put them in these categories: denialism of climate change and more. Just carry on. Often this narrative is underwritten by powerful money-backed interests, implicit in much advertising, unfortunately quite prevalent in my part of the world, in the United States and Canada, still, especially the United States, in terms of the political power of the denialists. Eco-modernists is challenging, because I think there would be eco-modernists who would say, no, we're fully in tune with the mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. It just means you have to get humans completely separated from nature. We have to move people into cities, and that's how you protect nature. It relies massively on decoupling, so efficient use of material and energy, but it completely ignores, at least in my analysis, the Jevons paradox, with no solution of how to prevent using more of the thing you're getting more efficient in using. That's, I think, a pretty well-established phenomenon. Throws precaution to the wind and very deep faith in human ingenuity. There's a great paper by Bruno Latour, who was invited by some eco-modernists to talk, and he said he was intrigued by it, and he said, look, I'm not a nature guy, I don't like going out in nature that much, I'm more of a city person. But ultimately, he said, to me, it sounds much like the news that an electronic cigarette is going to save a chain smoker from addiction. And then there's this in between, the growth-insistent sustainable development goals and green growth. We have to start with this kind of thinking. I won't deny that. You know, we are in a system where growth is going to have to be harnessed, hopefully, for greener ways of producing, consuming, dealing with each other and with the natural world. But it can seem to me like eco-modernism light with rampant greenwashing or very hopeful thinking that doesn't seem justified. But it has UN endorsement and broad institutional support, so it is a counter narrative to take seriously. So I'll close with these thoughts. Ecological law should embrace legal plurality and support life-enhancing place-based legal systems built around territories of life and a vision of a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. This requires reconfiguring true human needs and denormalizing many modern habits of overproduction and overconsumption. Because activities in one place impact and are impacted by activities elsewhere, and some impacts are global, and communities are linked through cultural and material exchange, local territories of life or legal systems cannot and do not exist in isolation. So the principle of subsidiarity should apply so that levels of law and governance between or overarching these territories of life or ecological systems should respect their autonomy and be life enhancing. I can envision regional and interregional systems of ecological law that foster a series of umbrella territories of life that reach up to the global level, at least if we keep that territories of life everywhere on Earth vision central here. And finally, ecological law is unquestionably, in the way I see things right now, about moving past harmful legacies of colonialism and capitalism. So a lot of I think some controversial points perhaps here, but I'm happy to share this thinking and to hear what you make of it. And this is a work in progress, and so your reactions and thoughts on this are most welcome. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Before I will join you there, I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. It was really, really super thought-provoking. And as all your presentations, I always learn a lot. Before we go to the online audience, Judith, would you like to perhaps pose a question or engage with Jeff at whatever level? It seems to me certainly that many of the things that he has said, there's a lot of overlap with the stuff that you are doing. And I want to give you an opportunity, because you are, and I'm grateful for that, to engage with Jeff.
And ich kann nicht lesen, so I don't know whether I'm sharing. I don't know what.
Over there, and then I'll see. Oh, there we go. Please.
Yeah, thank you.
Is this how it should be now? Okay.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I learned a lot. First, I wanted to ask you if you're familiar with the work of Joe Brewer. He, I think, was a systems theory professor somewhere in in the US. He quit his job, and now he just works on bioregions and regenerating bioregions. And I think this whole concept and the communities building around that would be super interesting for you to get in touch. Maybe that's the first thing what I was thinking. Secondly, I'm not sure how to feel about the sacrifice zones. I think it really helps us to see the problems there. And I really liked how you explained that it comes, the word itself is rooted in sacredness, and how we consider maybe growth as something sacred, a higher level goal. But at the same time, we do not even see mostly which zones are declared sacrifice zones, right? Mainly because of corporate PR, it all looks like it's going to be developed and it's going to be super great. And then we have the Niger Delta polluted forever, massive ecocide. And then again, I think, yeah, this idea that we can, at this point of the climate crisis, even map out the sacrifice zones that are being declared right now. It's super hard. So yeah, that's maybe the question I have to this term, and I'm curious what you think of it. And maybe to bring it to one point, I think it really doesn't help us to ask the accountability question. And I think the accountability question is super important to move away from the contemporary law constructions to the ecological law. And of course, there we have the whole concept around ecocide, putting the accountability question in the center of ecological destruction. And I didn't see it in your list of laws. I didn't see the criminal law and the concepts. So I was wondering how you feel about that and the broader question of accountability when it comes to ecological destruction.
Yeah, first of all, I'm familiar with Joe Brewer's name. I used to see him on Twitter. I think I followed him, but I got rid of Twitter when a certain person made it his private fiefdom. So I don't know. But thanks for the reminder. And I'm sure there's many other people that are working on similar approaches, bioregionalism and so on.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot to bring in there. Ecocide. I need to dig into that. For some reason, when I've gone there, I have said this is not. This is still using an old framing that I want to get away with. But I think this more core idea of accountability is really important. One thing that I have trouble with there is that the accountability seems diffuse. So if we're talking about something that's illegal now, then it's illegal now. If we're talking about something that's sort of legally and accepted, which is the kind of thing we're talking about, sacrifice zones. So, for example, the region in northern Alberta, which is affecting Indigenous communities and so on, or we could come up with countless examples. Things that are legal now, but are extremely damaging. Accountability for these forest fires that are the frequency with which these fires used to happen in Canada was, I read, 150 to 200 years. Now they're happening more like every 30 to 50 years. You have the accountability question there, but at some point it gets so diffuse, comes down to me and how I'm investing perhaps my retirement funds. I haven't. I'm almost embarrassed to confess. I don't know how to completely extract myself to that kind of system. And there's so many other things. So I think it's important to talk about that. I don't, and it's a nice reminder to not forget that's a part of it. Perhaps I need to give the ecocide work a fresh reading. I'm not against that movement. I think it's like rights of nature. It's pushing things in the right direction, but in ways that I find a little problematic. And maybe I'm too purist, but that's sort of how I see that, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. I see a hand from Julia Thrall. Julia, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for this very informative and thought-provoking lecture. I have made many notes and I will read through it and surely learn more from the second and third reading. I'm I wonder if you are familiar with the work of Professor Anna Greer. She has done things on property and personhood. And my experiences as a business ethicist, working with companies, is you can't trust them. And they will use a legal personhood by any nature thing to engage lawyers representing the rights of these rivers, whatever, and will just make a very bad case, like a racist lawyer for black people in the US criminal system, where we know that some lawyers are on purpose not doing a good job. I mean, some are just overworked and not well paid, but very often they are, for racist reasons, do not represent their clients very well. And this will happen as soon as we start the legal personhood route concerning nature. I'm very worried about this. And the astroturfing of NGOs, that happens a lot, especially here in Germany, where you think you're working with an NGO that has social rights of people at heart. And then you look into the impressum of the website and you find out it actually belongs to some business body or some DAX company that pretends to be an NGO to lobby in the name of the people. Yeah. Who so I'm very afraid of this whole legal personhood route. I would rather go the way of the commons to protect nature. I feel that might be sharing the responsibility and making people stand up for nature might be a far better protection to stop the capitalist system taking over again.
Well, I think you raised many good points. One thing that a distinction that I think need to develop more, but certainly have in mind, is when you have something like the Whanganui River, where rights of nature are emerging from what I guess I would call a place. It has a place-based origin. So what I've read there is that the Maori there, the reason the settlement was okay to them, and they held out for 130 years. So the fact that they would settle, I think, is important. Is that what that settlement and treaty represents to them is that the river and decision making about it there will be given particular regard will be given to core ideas within their worldview. The river, we are the river is us. The river is one living entity that flows from the mountains to the sea. And it's a very place-based definition, and you have a guardian in which they are one seat, and the New Zealand government is another. By the way, there's other places where territory, I think the national park there has been given legal personhood from the colonial government perspective view. From the Maori point of view, it's like it's been imbued with the relationships and that emerge from their worldview. And in those situations, the guardianship has majority Maori representation. That's a different model than you have, for example, in Ecuador, where it's put in the constitution, and the same government that is then the steward of the concept, because it's constitutional and at that level, is actually opposing the expansion of rights of nature when it gets in litigation, because they're representing state mining companies. So there were in the last couple of years, there have been some very strong results favoring rights of nature in that context. But it's very fragile, and many of you might know Hugo Echeverria, who works on those cases, and he's talked to my class a couple times, and he's like, those are real, just like we said, they're really, 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 really good lawyers, and they've got their eyes on every avenue to keep this from going too far, and it may get back into more of a political arena if it doesn't work out so much in the constitutional court. So I think you have different models here in which rights of nature is playing a role, and the Whanganui River one seems more grounded, I guess would be one way to put it. And it's for all of the reasons, the very thoughtful reasons you said. And Anna Greer, some of the PhD fellows in our program have co-written work with her, ideas of pluriversal thinking, the many worlds, not the one world view of place, and so yeah, she's an important person in this, and we're lucky to be working with her within the leadership of the Ecological project.
Yeah.
Julia, I see your hand is up. I suspect it's a response. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just this is all fine. I'm worried about those cases where the representation of nature is dependent on a few people, because I've seen in South Africa, or we can see in Canada, that even in the First Nations, even in the people living there are corrupt leaders as well as they are in other human groups. And they can screw up as well. So I find, or I would promote to find a solution where a lot of people are responsible, because then the chance is bigger that not one person can be corrupted with money as a representative of their community or the First Nation responsible for that piece of land. Because especially in South Africa, we've seen it so many times that companies manage to either blackmail or corrupt the leaders of that village, and then everything got pear-shaped again. So I'm a bit worried about, just because we have a few good examples where it worked very well, doesn't mean there isn't a real danger.
I agree with you. I'm glad you raised that. It's a very good point.
Thank you very much. So there is a comment from Stephanie Kunden. Since corporate power and capitalism is likely to continue to shape our societies in the short to medium term, what you've also pointed out, certainly, what are pragmatic and promising / legal approaches to dealing with corporate interests, lobbying, and so forth? That was also going to be actually one of my questions. How do we move this forward in practical terms?
First of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that within the corporate world, within the capitalist world, there are many, many people who take the problems of the ecological crisis with climate change, biodiversity loss, all of them, very seriously, and want to operate their business in a way that's responsive to that. So I think one thing is to engage with those people in kind of dialogue and how you can best use the forces of profit making, if that's what it is, or so on, to the best result. In any path forward, more efficient use of material and energy is important. So this is not an anti-technology proposal, ecological law. It's just maybe framing it a little differently, So this, if you don't deal with this Jevons paradox or the rebound effect, so that becoming more efficient doesn't lead, as the normal forces of capitalism will tend to lead to more use of the material, then you've got a problem. But that's a discussion I think you can have with a lot of people in that world. I think hopefully these ecological case studies, where we consciously said we need to have a transitional vision we included that instead of just, and not just a long-term vision of ecological law, so that we could talk about what's pragmatic and practical in those individual cases along the lines of what you're talking, and not just build something that looks like pie in the sky, as we say, but that seems more realistic and pragmatic. But yeah, good question.
Thanks. I mean, just perhaps a short comment on that. It seems to me that one of the root challenges that we need to address is this corporate hegemony and this very destructive stranglehold that the corporate world has both on political practices, legal practices, legal processes. I mean, that's something that I know Judith also comes up, that confronts you in the sort of climate arena every single day very vividly. And I'm increasingly thinking that the solution perhaps lies in trying to dismantle these very strong corporate lobbying groups that seem to have a very influential stranglehold and influence on the shape and the form and the depth and the reach of our political processes. And only once we can do that would we be able to sort of identify a state shift in how we approach ecological governance.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. So I was talking to someone in Canada where, you say, well, how in the world, and can you make this decision to approve this oil exploration and eventual development in the middle of a climate emergency in fragile waters? But we know the answer is that there's all kinds of conversation and dealings that are happening that never come out into the open, it seems. That and this dynamic that you're talking about comes into play. The governments in Canada and everywhere else are in a tough position because Canada with COVID, like many other places, has accumulated a deficit that was not anticipated. And Canada is even more so in the United States, like really deficit shy. And so there's very strong political pressure to drive down that debt, and they don't necessarily see where to go other than getting the revenue that they're going to get from these projects. It's a real it's a real conundrum. And so this person basically said Canada has a money problem and they don't know how to deal with it in a different way. That's an extremely difficult issue, I think, in that. But I agree with what you're saying. The mechanics of it are extremely difficult.
Thanks for that reflection, Jeff. I have a hand from Stephanie Kunkel. Yes, please, Stephanie.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the response. I would like to add that maybe, of course, dismantling those lobby organizations is certainly a good step. On the other hand, probably there are also a lot of barriers to overcome to dismantle the lobby organizations. And another approach I would still see is to talk to these people in terms of how can they become agents of change. Maybe it's a bit idealistic, but we're doing research on digitalization in industry, and whenever I talk to people from industry, and then I point to this rebound and Jevons paradox and questions of efficiency versus sufficiency, etc. There's also very little understanding, and it may seem illogical, but I think for a lot of people it's still hard to grasp that efficiency is not going to solve these issues, because this problem only shows up at a macro level, and many people don't think on the macro scale, right? Because they're working in their micro environments, it seems to me, and within their worlds it doesn't seem so illogical to pursue these efficiencies, and then maybe there's still some room to educate people about these problems, but I would also prefer the other option of abolishing lobby power.
Yeah, and I think another thing to build in is alternative models. And the one that my go-to one, and I have a lot to learn here. It's not necessarily in the immediate focus of mine, but I do a community supported agriculture basket, and so I pay up front, and then I buy my weekly basket from mid-June and until the first week of November, where I am. If it's a good year, in terms of weather and so on, I get a little bit more. If it's a bad year, I share the pain with everybody else. These are not farmers who want to grow their business. They want to make a modest living, dealing with a steady set of customers year to year. So it's not profit oriented and it's not growth oriented. It's providing for them. It's providing for us. So I hope that those kind of models, and you could see it with cooperatives and other things where more employee owned businesses and so on, that those might be part of the puzzle, but solve or the answer.
Then one question from Letitia: could profit be somehow regulated towards social environmental aims? That's an interesting question. That's sort of flipping it, isn't it? So what do you think? If we were that's a very interesting question, because if we were to stay within this profit sort of neoliberal paradigm, if I assume correctly, that is what Letitia sort of suggests, but could we then reframe it and use it for ecological benefits?
We have this has got to be a big part of answering the challenge in the short term, and at least in the transitional period. In the long term, I think the questions get harder and harder. But you have all this work that's, for example, being framed around cradle to cradle, where you're working with business who have a profit motive, but they're going to, and sometimes for as long as they can keep their business model okay, they're very open to using different materials to get a result, or take a very systems-based approach. Some things with green building, for example, the charrettes they have, it's putting your mind together to still construct the thing or produce the thing, but with lower impact because you're using different materials. The one thing that does not work, I think, that I question and have not seen a convincing response to, is the whole environmental covenants curve. So that's the idea. It's still a profit-based model that as a country, and it's important to say this is a country, gets wealthier. They go through the industrial phase and they shift to services. During the industrial phase, many of you probably know this, pollution mounts, and then in the shift to services, pollution goes down, and people are wealthy and happy. Well, but that was developed without looking at the global picture. It doesn't take into account offshoring all of the environmental problems and so on. So if somebody can show me a global environmental covenants curve, I might start listening. Until then, I kind of block that up.
Good point. Excellent point. Are there any further comments, any further hands? I see there's one more in the chat box. Let's see. And the comment is from Julia. It's not only about lower impact, but we need to question every product, service, if it is useful and sustainable or not. Julia, I don't know whether I got that exactly right. Do you want to phrase it yourself? You're very welcome. So let's just take that as a general comment. Julia, yes.
Yeah, it was a kind of answer to the question, could profit be somehow regulated towards social and environmental aims? And yes, there are companies trying to do that. The lawmakers, especially in the EU, have now understood that the legal framework has to change for them to do that, because you can't find investors if you don't want to have a growth model and things like that. So there are lawmakers very smart enough to understand that the legal framework has to change, but obviously this big business is not happy about this, and it could also be a danger of taking the responsibilities from the state towards organizations. So, for example, care duties. So, by human rights law, the governments have a duty of care for their citizens and providing health care and stuff like this. And now, if you give it to these purpose companies, they can avoid it because they say, well, there is a purpose company. And these purpose companies actually are able to avoid human rights. So they can say, we only take Roman Catholics, or we only take old people, or we only take young people, and things like that. And the same goes for the environment. So the same purpose companies can say, well, we protect trees, but we do not protect the birds and the insects in the wood, and stuff like that. So there is a way of using capitalism to protect nature, but not really. It looks very nice for the first half an hour when you read the papers, and as soon as you start digging in, you start crying and lose hope. So I just wanted to answer that question. Yes, there are people arguing for that kind of green business models to work within the capitalism, but I haven't seen anything yet that actually could not be misguided. And I have worked in the industry beforehand. I'm a former investment banker. I know how these people tick. I know they find every reason to make money. They do not read the spirit of the law. They read the letter of the law, and they will always find a way of using that to their advantage. So I'm not hopeful to find a way within capitalism. We have to stop that system. Otherwise, we won't rescue our planet. Or at least not for the 100%, maybe only for the top 10% or so.
Thank you for those powerful thoughts, Julia. I think everyone present here would agree with that. Jeff, any final word from you? A word of encouragement, perhaps.
Well, you know, I'll say one thing about this framing around territories of life and holding out what seems like an idealistic vision on the horizon is a hopeful vision. It allows me to keep focused on that vision, despite having to deal in the short and medium term with some really gnarly, difficult challenges like the ones that are brought up in this, in this hour and a half. So thank you very much for raising those points, reminding me and everyone here how connected they are, and I hope this leads to some ongoing connections. I'm happy to stay in touch with anyone who listens in that wants to keep the conversation going. Thanks very much, Louis, and everybody here.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So on behalf of the Institute, on behalf of Bernardo, myself, the Focal Topic team, and everyone who joined us, thank you very, very much for an extremely thought-provoking presentation, for coming all the way to lovely Potsdam and to sharing this, and certainly also for sharing some ideas that we can take home and work with, and hopefully collectively we can come up with better solutions that are tailor-made that we so urgently need. Thank you for all of you who have joined us, and we will take a short couple of weeks break over the summer here in Europe, and then we will be back very soon with our public lecture. So please check out our website and the newsletter. We will be in touch with the details of our next presentation. Have a lovely day, everyone. Please stay in touch, and looking forward to seeing you soon again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.